Redditors who have been lost in the wilderness, what's your story? I moved to Tennessee about a year ago. I made some friends around here, and one of the guys, who looked pretty outdoorsy, told me he was going to lead a hike in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It sounded like fun, so I said yes. He told me that he knew the trail we would be hiking, that he had a map, and that he was a very experienced outdoorsman. It was late winter when this happened, and all the guys involved were college-aged. We parked near a place called Elkmont. The leader, let's call him Jason, told us we were taking a trail loop called Cucumber Gap. A little way down the trail, though, we must have taken the wrong split and headed west instead of looping east. There were signs along the way that we had taken the wrong trail. We passed campsites that weren't supposed to be there, although no one was camping in them since it was still quite cold. There were also a couple of trail splits that we passed, which Jason said were in the wrong direction. That map Jason was supposed to have. He hadn't brought it, because he wouldn't need it. On top of that, none of us had cell phone signal at this point. We had started the hike around 1 p.m., and it was only supposed to take at most 4 hours, according to Jason. It was about 7 p.m. and getting dark when I was absolutely sure we had gone the wrong way, and I finally felt confident enough to tell Jason so. He disagreed and wanted to keep going, saying things like, "We're almost there, I know it." We walked a little farther until I was finally able to convince the others to turn around. It took about an hour to reach one of the campsites we had passed earlier. I took a quick inventory at the campsite. Most of the guys were wearing warm jackets, although 2 of them only had long-sleeve shirts. I had an emergency blanket in my pack, so I let those 2 share it. We had warmth covered. About half of the guys had brought water, but I had plenty of extra since I sweat a lot when I hike, even in winter. So we had enough water to share. Everyone had brought at least some snacks, granola bar type stuff. Food, check. I had a small keychain flashlight, and another guy had brought a larger flashlight. I also had a small survival kit that I keep in an old cigarette carton. Inside, I keep a small fire steel, a pocket knife, and a few other random items. Since it looked like no one had camped there for a few months, there was plenty of firewood around. It was a little wet, though, since it had rained a few days earlier. I shaved off some of the inside of the wood for tinder and finally managed to get a fire going in the fire pit after about 30 minutes. Tip: if you don't know how to use a fire steel, it's basically useless. I've practiced starting fires with it many times because I think it's cool, but if you've never used one before, practice before you rely on it. Once the fire was started, everyone's spirits lifted. A few people were even able to take off their jackets. We were a little hungry, but otherwise fine. At least we were warm and hydrated. People were a bit pissed at Jason at first, but that faded fairly quickly. We talked, told jokes, and shared funny stories. When it was time to sleep, we just laid down next to the fire on the ground. It wasn't comfortable at all without sleeping bags, and I don't think anyone slept very well. I stayed up most of the night keeping the fire going. The next morning, we woke up early and started backtracking. I make a habit of looking behind me every so often while hiking so I know what the trail looks like going the opposite direction. Because of that, I remembered which direction we were supposed to take at the final split. It turned out we were supposed to turn left to stay on the Cucumber Gap loop, while going right took us onto a completely different trail. It took about 5 or 6 hours to hike out. Eventually, we reached a road and found the spot where we had parked. I had told my parents I was going hiking, but not where or for how long, so they hadn't been worried. I think most of the other guys were in the same situation. No one had really known we were missing, which was a big mistake and could have put us in real danger. Sorry if this is long, or if the story feels anticlimactic since everything turned out fine. I just thought it might spark a good discussion about what you should actually do if you get lost in the woods. Things we did wrong: never rely completely on your leader, even if they've been there before. People make mistakes. At least 2 or 3 people in your group should have maps and be actively checking to make sure you're on the right trail. Never assume you're going the right way. Use a compass as well. If I had taken my compass out of my survival kit, I would have realized much sooner that we were heading in the wrong direction. Always tell someone exactly where you're going and when you'll be back. And always bring enough light sources if there's any chance you'll be hiking near dark. Things we did right: we had enough water and were dressed appropriately. No one panicked when we realized we were lost. Once it got dark, we stayed put. It's almost always better to stay on the trail if there are no injuries or immediate life-threatening conditions like hypothermia. Someone could easily twist an ankle in the dark, especially with limited light and mountainous terrain. We were able to make a fire and stay warm. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to subscribe for more. My friends and I love outdoorsy activities. One day, we decided to drive a few hours to do some spelunking, caving. This particular cave is near a river, so it has a maze of streams inside it, along with a waterfall. Being young and stupid, we didn't have much of a plan and just went for it. It turns out it started raining while we were inside. The rain partially flooded the cave and sealed off many of the passageways. It was unreal: you could actually see the water levels rising. Needless to say, we completely freaked out and did some incredibly stupid things, like swimming through some of the flooded narrow passages. When we finally made it out, we were starving, dehydrated, cold, and bleeding. It turns out we had spent around 13 hours in the cave. My friend wanted to go camping on a 2-day, 1-night trip during a snowstorm to test our gear to the fullest. We weren't using tents, but instead hammocks, sleeping bags, tarps, and ropes. I was in Northern California with a friend, a bit above Forest Ranch, camping somewhere between 6,000 and 6,500 feet in Lassen National Park. There were already about 4 inches of snow on the ground when we arrived. We parked my red car on a large turnout, grabbed our gear, and headed east off the road, which was the only highway running through the forested region. We walked about half a mile into the thick forest, with occasional clear-cut areas from logging. We started by hanging the tarps for rain and snow cover. We spent a couple of hours trying to start a fire because everything was wet and it was almost impossible to get one going. Then we set up the hammocks, but my friend had forgotten his, so he had to use some thick painting tarps to rig one up. I knew it was going to take him a while, so I decided to go for a hike alone to reach the top of the mountain, look around, and gather things for camp. It was about an hour before sundown. I told him I would be back in an hour and that I had my gun, but I wasn't going to shoot it, since we had seen bear droppings near camp. I headed out wearing a thermal top and bottom, boxers, a beanie, a t-shirt, a hoodie, wool socks with small plastic bags around each foot, hiking boots, a snowboarding jacket, snowboarding pants, and gloves that were not waterproof at all. I had a Smith & Wesson pocket knife that wasn't very sharp, a Glock 19 with 10 rounds and a holster, a bright waterproof headlamp, and an iPod with headphones. I headed up the mountain listening to music, relaxing and enjoying nature. I left tracks in the snow except in areas where there was no snow because the trees had caught it all. I reached the top, about 1 to 1.5 miles from camp, turned around, and enjoyed the view. By then, my gloves were frozen solid and unusable, and my hands were starting to freeze. It was time to head back. I followed my footprints in the snow until I reached a very large area with no snow and couldn't pick up my tracks again. I have a decent sense of direction, so I continued walking in the general direction where camp should have been. After about 20 more minutes, it started raining and I realized I was a little lost. I started yelling in groups of 3 to try to get a response from my friend. Then the sun went down, and it got dark fast. I took my gun out and fired one shot, then waited. No response. I was lost in the woods at night. I turned on my headlamp and tried signaling with it, but nothing. I put the headlamp on and started walking and backtracking while yelling the whole time. A few hours passed, and I still couldn't find camp in the pitch dark. I realized I wasn't sleeping at camp that night. I was sleeping in the woods. It was windy and snowing, with temperatures well below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and I started questioning whether it was even possible to survive the night. I tried to cut down small pine trees with my knife, but it was cheap and barely worked, even after sharpening it. I ended up pulling snow-covered saplings out of the ground by hand while freezing. I was soaked from head to toe. The waterproof jacket, pants, and boots had all failed. Eventually, I pulled out about 11 saplings and laid them on the ground next to a tree that didn't have snow underneath it. That was my bed for the night. I zipped up my jacket, pulled my hood all the way over my head, shoved my hands into the cold, wet pockets, and curled into a fetal position under the tree. Your mind goes to a dark place when you know you're close to death. I can barely admit the thoughts I was having. They were very dark, and I never want to go there again. I was beyond freezing and completely soaked. I was shivering so violently it almost felt like a seizure. It was a brutal night. I had to keep moving my muscles and toes every few minutes to keep blood flowing and avoid frostbite, all while hoping I wouldn't develop hypothermia. Somehow, I woke up in the morning. I realized it wasn't a dream. I was still lost, and there were another 2 inches of snow on the ground. I had followed my tracks multiple times during the night and had 2 to 5 sets of footprints on every path I took. I admit that I had been walking in circles when I thought I was moving straight. I knew I couldn't rely on my tracks anymore. I had to pick a direction and commit to it. Eventually, I reached a logging road, at least 15 feet wide. I figured it would either lead back to the highway or deeper into the forest, so I had to choose carefully. Based on the sun's position, I knew I had to go either north or south. I chose south and hoped it was the right call. I walked over 5 miles down that road, making signals in the snow like my name, arrows showing my direction, and a large SOS. I also kept yelling in groups of 3. Eventually, I heard a car on the highway in the distance. That sound was pure relief. I kept walking until I reached the highway. I stood directly on the double yellow lines and put on my most miserable face to get someone to stop. A Dish Network truck eventually pulled over and gave me a ride up the road to my parked car. After that, I headed back toward our camp and fired another shot from my gun, a victory shot to celebrate being alive. I yelled, my friend responded, and I finally made it back to camp with my life and all my limbs. When I was about 8 years old, my mom and I moved in with a friend of hers who had a son several years older than me. Let's call him Travis. Travis was a fucking psychopath. I was really into stage magic at the time and had just received a little magician outfit with the hat, cape, and everything, so keep that outfit in mind. One day, Travis was watching wrestling on TV and got super amped up, so we went out to the trampoline. That's where he proceeded to beat the shit out of me while screaming about the culinary endeavors of The Rock and farting on my face. Anyway, he accidentally sat on my face and broke my nose. I was crying, there was blood everywhere, and he knew he was about to get in serious trouble. So he decided to lead me into the woods under the pretext of taking me to a nearby relative to get some band-aids. Instead, he ditched me in the woods. In a magician costume. I wandered around crying for a while before remembering some bullshit from school about leaving markers behind if you ever get lost, so you can tell if you're walking in circles or not. So I started taking off my outfit and leaving pieces of it hanging from tree branches. At some point, I stumbled out of the woods and ran into a neighbor who was oddly nonchalant about a half-dressed little boy emerging from the forest in tidy whities and a magician hat, with blood all over his face. About 3 years ago, I struggled severely with depression and suicidal thoughts. Those thoughts eventually manifested into plans. I would stay up at night thinking about how I wanted to leave this world. I thought about pills, slitting my wrists, all the cliché stuff you see in movies. Eventually, though, I settled on what I called a slow bleed method. I made a plan to drive the 2 hours from my house to Inyo National Forest after work on a Friday and get lost. The plan was simple and stupid. I would try to survive as long as possible until something killed me, whether it was dehydration, exhaustion, or whatever else nature decided to throw at me. I ordered some basic survival essentials on Amazon, packed a bag, and left as planned. I don't know what made the slow bleed idea so seductive, but my mind was set on it. I had no idea where I was going, but that drive felt like I was 10 years old again, on my way to Disneyland with my parents for the first time. I felt strangely overjoyed and relieved. I arrived, parked my car behind some bushes, and started walking. It was about 5 o'clock and the sun was dropping fast, which was bad planning on my part, so I started running deeper and deeper into the forest. I would run until I got tired, then walk for a while, then run again. I repeated this cycle for about 3 hours. Eventually, I stopped in a clearing. It was a small, round patch of mostly dead grass and leaves. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and fell asleep, happy as could be. The next morning was far less tranquil. I woke up feeling like I had a terrible hangover, and for at least 5 minutes I had no idea where I was or how I had gotten there. I started breathing rapidly and began jogging in random directions, trying to retrace my steps. Instead, I only got more lost and ended up separating myself from my gear and tent. I tried telling myself this was what I wanted, but for some reason I knew it wasn't anymore. I remember repeating, "No choice," over and over again. That night was brutally cold. I tried doing push-ups to keep warm, but that didn't last long. I tried singing "Vienna" by Billy Joel, but I was too cold and my teeth wouldn't stop chattering. The cold, however, was nothing compared to the fear. Every falling leaf or trickle of water sounded like a vicious predator in my mind. At one point, I couldn't tell whether I was shaking from fear, the cold, or both. Eventually, morning came. I slept through most of the day on the ground with my back against a fallen tree stump. I woke up around 3 in the afternoon and panicked again. I started jogging in what felt like another random direction until I suddenly hit the road I had come in on. The relief I felt is something I'll never be able to fully explain. It humbled me and lifted me up at the same time. I walked along the road until a very kind older man in a big black truck pulled over to see if I needed help. I told him I had been hiking and gotten lost. He drove me back up the road to my car, and I drove home. That weekend changed everything for me. I never had suicidal thoughts again, and I got the help I needed to deal with my depression. This isn't much of a survival story, but the experience completely changed my perspective on life and self-worth. I'm still working on building a life that feels right for me, but whenever I feel discouraged or want to quit, I think back to that night in the forest. After a quick shudder, I remember just how much my life means to me. It was a stupid plan, but I'm glad it was. I might not have survived a slightly more elaborate one. This story doesn't involve me getting lost, but I was separated from my friend in the middle of nowhere, and he was almost delirious from heat and dehydration when I found him. I grew up in a small mining town in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. When I was a kid, the town was still pretty small, with only about 3,000 people living there. It was basically surrounded by dry, arid bushland, with desert further out. There was a dam and a few other places with water nearby, but massive stretches of nothing much in between. One day, some of my schoolmates were bragging about riding their push bikes all the way to a roadhouse on the Great Northern Highway, roughly halfway between our town and the next one. The roadhouse was a good 2 to 2.5 hour drive away, with a speed limit of mostly 110 kilometers per hour. The road had loads of hills, and the Pilbara summer sun is brutally hot. Riding there on a bike as a 13 or 14-year-old kid would have been nearly impossible without serious preparation, rest stops, plenty of water, sunblock, and some kind of portable shade. They claimed they did it wearing nothing but their school uniforms and drinking water from a puddle along the way. I knew they had to be lying, and I decided to put the ringleader in his place. He was the only other guy my size in school, way better at sports, and never let me forget it. I challenged him in front of about 20 other kids, most of whom were part of his unofficial fan club, to do the ride again with me. I said I would bring supplies in case he wanted to give up, and he could recreate his heroic, living off the land, feat like a true pioneering trailblazer. To my surprise, instead of backing out with some excuse about how I was stupid for suggesting it, he agreed. To my even greater surprise, that Saturday morning he showed up at the meeting point on the edge of town wearing only a shirt, shorts, shoes, and his bike. There was a water bottle in the holder on his frame, but it was only about a quarter full. We idiotically set off at a fast pace, like we were going to get there and back by lunchtime. About half an hour in, when we started to get tired, I began to lag behind him. Eventually, we reached a twisty section of road where the highway cut through large rocky hills, and I lost sight of him as he went around a bend. I was absolutely wrecked by that point, so I stopped to rest for about 10 minutes. When I started riding again, there was still no sign of him, not even on the next long straight stretch of road. I don't know exactly how long I kept going, but I started to panic that he might have collapsed from dehydration just minutes ahead of me, so I pushed on. Eventually, I was so exhausted that I couldn't pedal uphill anymore and had to walk the bike. The road was so hot that I could feel it through my shoes. I finally gave up, feeling worse than I ever had before. I was convinced I had gotten him killed. About 30 minutes later, as I was coasting back down the road, I spotted a small goat track running down the side of a hill into a cluster of trees and decided to rest in the shade. When I got most of the way down the track, I saw his bike lying in the dirt and immediately started calling his name. When I found him, he was sitting on a tree root, his throat too dry to make any sound. I gave him a bottle of water, which he drank too quickly, then spent a couple of minutes coughing and spluttering. We were both completely wrecked. Eventually, we walked our bikes back up to the road and were lucky enough to get picked up by a guy in a Uda, the Australian version of a pickup truck. When we got back to town, we went to my parents' house and played Sega inside for about 3 hours, then he went home. I fell asleep around 4 in the afternoon and didn't wake up until my mom came into my room at 9 the next morning to see what was wrong with me. I never told my parents what actually happened. I just said we'd been building jumps at the bike track in the bush across the road all day. At lunch break on Monday, my new friend left his usual group to come find me and invited me to play Foursquare with them. They thought he was planning to make a fool of me and made a few comments about how I was totally wrong about them riding to the roadhouse. I just nodded and said, "Yeah, he showed me." That was that. We were never close friends, but he always respected me after that and stopped encouraging the others when they gave me a hard time. Years later, We both ended up part of a silly school initiative called the School Council. He was the recreation representative, and I was the environment one. We also went to the city together on a couple of school trips as the sports and debate captains, respectively. I'm a hunter. It's a great way for me to escape the everyday hustle and bustle and just sit alone in the woods, watching it either wake up or go to sleep. On this particular day, I was deer hunting about 20 feet up in a tree. Anyone who hunts knows that you stay out until dark, then pack up your stuff and head out. Sunset was around 5 p.m., and I stayed in the tree until about 5:40. I climbed down, packed up my gear, and then realized I didn't have a flashlight. No big deal, I had my phone. Except, it was down to 5% battery. I was so far out in the woods, with a long hike in, that it had been searching for signal the entire time and drained itself. I shut the phone off to conserve what little battery I had left. I figured I'd be fine and started walking back. Even though I spent a lot of time outdoors and practically lived in the woods every weekend as a kid, I can still get lost. There's a moment I can't really describe when you realize you're lost. It's dark, you have no flashlight, and no idea which way to go. It's an unsettling feeling. You're panicking on the inside, but you know panicking won't help, so you try to calm yourself down. I did that for a while before deciding to just sit down. By that point, I had been lost in the woods, in the dark, without a flashlight, for about 3 hours. It was an overcast night with a new moon, so I had zero light to work with. I decided to stay put, take inventory of what I had, and remain calm. I turned my phone back on and sent my fiancée a text that said, "Phone dying. Lost in woods. May spend the night here. I won't die, promise. Love you." Then I turned the phone off again, saving that last 3% in case I needed to make an emergency call. It was around 9 p.m. I realized I wasn't going to die out there, but I definitely wasn't going to have a fun night. I had a gun, plenty of ammo, good clothing, and a bottle of water. Oh, and a full pack of cigarettes. I could start a fire and be fine. Wait. I could start a fire. I could build a torch. Why hadn't I thought of that earlier? I had some paracord in my hunting pack that I normally use to pull my gun up the tree after I climb it. I cut off a section, bundled together some leaves, sticks, and bark, and made a torch. Everything was wet, so I used some lip balm on the cord to help it catch. The torch worked, not perfectly, but enough that I could see. Eventually, I found a trail I recognized, even by the dim light of the torch, and followed it back to my truck. If it hadn't been for that cigarette lighter, I probably would have spent the night out there. I got to my truck, called my fiancée, who was completely freaking out, and headed home for a beer.